Okay, so you should be able to see just my screen at the moment, slide screen.
Yes, we can. Thanks,
Okay.
Amelia. That's great.
Alrighty. So as Katrina mentioned, my name is Amelia O'Donnell and I'm a paper conservator. I'm also a 2020 George Alexander Foundation Fellow with the International Specialised Skills Institute. And today I'm talking about my applied research project, which is based in community-centred cultural heritage conservation. Sorry, wrong order. So first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that this is a contested space. So I pay my respects to both the Yagara and the Turnbull people and their elders past and present. And I acknowledge that the traditional custodians of land where we're meeting on today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. Okay. Starting with something silly, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm sure we've all been to a lot more online events than we would have rather to be in person at, especially thank you to those people in New South Wales and Victoria. So what is a conservator? It's not a straightforward answer like any vocation, but I can tell you some things, that we're responsible for the care of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible. Our profession combines art, science, ethical guidelines, and sometimes cultural protocols. The judgments we make about how we preserve an object can be objective, or subjective. The materials and techniques used for conservation treatment must be archivally stable and reversible. Conservators work in a variety of settings, including academia or universities, in cultural heritage institutions, or in galleries, libraries, archives, or museums, and also in private conservation studios or commercial conservation studios. Often we'll specialise in a specific material type, like textiles or objects, paintings, paper, photographs, metals, that kind of thing. And there are many different pathways to becoming a conservator. And our roles all encompass a real diverse set of expertise and duties. So the way that I explain my job to someone at a barbecue or something is to sort of say that I'm like a cosmetic surgeon, but I work with paper rather than with the human body. My pathway to becoming a conservator looks different to others. It's going to be different for everyone. So I'm just going to talk about my experience and my journey today. It doesn't represent those of other conservators necessarily. I started studying fine art printmaking at RMIT University in Melbourne. And then, like a lot of fine art graduates, I went on to work in hospitality for a while. And then I went on to study a Master's in Cultural Materials Conservation at the Grimwade Centre at the University of Melbourne. And I'll tell you guys something today that I don't tell a lot of people, but I was actually going to apply for curatorial studies. I didn't know conservator was a job, but I clicked on the wrong link on the university website and I liked the sound of the course, so I sort of just took it from there. I think this story is a good analogy for the profession in a way, because perhaps when you compare what a curator does to what a conservator does, you might say curators are the face of exhibitions and public engagement with culture, whereas conservators do subtle work that's quiet and it often goes unnoticed behind the scenes. But the work is equally important. So after finishing my studies, I worked at the New South Wales State Archives and Records Authority, and before coming to Queensland in 2019 to start at the State Library of Queensland. So before I talk about my fellowship research, I'm going to talk to you about what I do in my daily work, because this has been really influential in forming my research objectives. And we'll just dip our toes in today because there's a lot of ground to cover. But do feel welcome to ask me any questions at the end of the presentation. So research, examination and documentation of collection items is something that I do in my daily work. Alex touched on it before with some of the technical examination. So before I make decisions about how to care for collections, I need to gather accurate information about the object. And this can include information about its physical properties, like its materials, how it was made, what condition it's in. I also look for information about provenance and the object's significance and its individual story. So conservators use different techniques to examine collection items, and I'll show you some of these in the next slides. It's also my responsibility to accurately document the collection item with written and photographic records that document its condition and formulate a report about that. And we often refer to these sorts of reports when we put collection items on exhibition or loan or lend to another institution. So for example, if I wanted to know if a collection had had prior conservation or restoration treatment, or how many times it had been exposed to light or been displayed in exhibition, I would refer back to these kind of reports. So one of the techniques we use is transmitted light. So that's just visible light that's directed through the object. And it's I use it a lot on paper-based collections to make visible watermarks or patterns that might help me identify the type of paper and how it was manufactured. It's also helpful in making more visible textural inconsistencies like or water damage or losses and repairs and tears. We also examine objects under visible light as a first step always. But if we want to try and identify specific materials or see under drawings or uncover faded signatures, we also use infrared wavelengths. So these sit beyond the visible spectrum. So on the left, we can see a photograph of a collection item example under visible light. And on the right, I've used infrared wavelengths to penetrate the surface of that image and reveal the underdrawings. So we can say from this image that the underdrawings are likely done in a carbon-based media because they absorb the infrared and they reflect it back, which makes it visible to the human eye. So here we have a sample object photographed under visible light again on the left, and we can sort of see some speckled markings on the card. And on the right, I photographed it using UV fluorescence. So when specific wavelengths of the UV spectra are directed at an object, these wavelengths excite certain materials and cause them to fluoresce. So for example, animal proteins fluoresce, and some photographs' image-forming layers are made of gelatin. So I might use UV examination of one of the preliminary steps in identifying what type of photograph this is. So in this one, we can see that the image area of the photograph doesn't fluoresce, which suggests that it might not be a silver gelatin print. It's probably something else. So this is sort of what a simplified version of what Alex touched on in her presentation. We also use microscopy quite a lot, and that's for examining collection objects and samples under microscopy, which is an essential tool in every conservator's toolkit. There's multiple variations on this technique and its purpose and its application. So in this context, our team has used a microscope to examine the sample of surface dirt that we gently brushed off from the face of a large painted banner. The surface of the banner was deteriorated and some of the paint was flaking off. So before proceeding with the complete brushing of the surface, we used a microscope to closely examine a sample of dirt that we gently removed. And from this examination, we could see whether or not there were inclusions of paint flakes in that sample. And this helped us to determine if surface cleaning with a soft brush was safe for the object. So in this case, there weren't paint flakes found in the sample, so we did continue to clean the whole banner. So that's a photograph of our team doing that. Another thing I do is prepare objects for access. So that's access by library users in the reading room or access via digitisation. So we digitise the object and that's the mode of access for the user. So that involves remedial conservation treatment to prepare them for digitisation or direct access. And my sort of common suite of objects I'll work on are maps and architectural plans, posters, historical letters and manuscripts, drawings and prints, photographs and photograph albums, or books and artist books. So this is an example of some work, business as usual, for me as a conservator. So for this object, which we can see as a map, it was getting prepared for digitisation. So it needs to be physically stable enough to be handled for that process. So that involved removal of the adhesive tapes and reduction of the stains. washing out the acidic deterioration byproducts in the pH balanced water bath, and then lining the map with Japanese tissue while it's flat and moistened and pasting down all the tears and folded areas, and then drying the map under a weighted pressing stack. So this document needed to be prepared for direct access and handling by library clients. So these documents came to my workbench and they were pretty dirty and damaged, and they were folded and tightly rolled. So in this state, they'd be difficult for anyone to handle without causing further damage. So similar to the map, I surface cleaned and flattened the documents before mending them with Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste, which, as I mentioned before, these materials are chemically stable and they're reversible. So that's in line with our professional ethics. And then I've put them into mylar sleeves. This is just an example of that. So they can be easily accessed and handled by library users without incurring further damage. Another bit of our common daily work is preparing objects for exhibition, and that means conservation treatment and mount making to prepare collection items to go on display. So for example, with conservation treatment, we need to ensure that the collection item's physically stable enough for exhibition. So with this object, we just reduce the acidic byproducts from the paper by washing it, and then we retouch the blemishes with dry pastel powder and toned back the appearance of those blemishes and losses in the image. This is another sort of conservation treatment that we do for exhibition. So this involved a music poster, which was screen printed, and we reduced the acidic byproducts from that paper again and infilled the losses with toned Japanese tissue. And that's so the eye just passes over the subtle mends rather than going straight to the area of damage. This is just a little example of mount making that we might do. So this is a little horn book, which is like a single piece of metal mounted on a piece of horn that used to be tied around a child's waist, and it was like a little book of phrases for them. So you can see I work with not just paper, also with objects sometimes, which can be challenging. This is a little mount, like a teeny tiny mount for a daguerreotype, which we have on exhibitions in our treasures wall at the moment. And this is Senior Conservator Rachel Spano on the left and me on the right, and that's us installing Jonathan Thurston's football boots into our Deadly Threads exhibition. So for those of you who follow rugby, you might know who Jonathan Thurston is. I didn't before I'd touched his boots, but that was fun. I also work with storage and handling of collections. So that's preparing archival housing for long-term storage of collections, preparing collection items for loan to other galleries or institutions, advising internal staff and library users on safe handling and collection of objects, and also a bit of public outreach, which is things like back of house tours to collection storage areas or conservation clinic, where we offer advice to the public about caring for their own collections, or white gloves events where library users can access materials and have a really good look through them in collections they usually wouldn't be able to access. So on the left, we've got some objects that we've prepared for transport. So the kind of housing and security that we put on those objects is different to long-term storage. Obviously, we need to protect them from any damage between institutions or lenders. And on the right, we've got long-term storage. So this is just a set of copper printmaking plates, and we've just put them in a nice cozy archival box. So they're not pressing up against each other or scratching, and they've got some padding between them. So safe handling of collection objects. This is an example of handling a collection object. So it can seem pretty straightforward at first, but what I say to people when they're handling collection objects is to just take a minute to have a look at it first before you pick it up and see if you can identify where you think it might be weak or vulnerable. This is an example of public outreach that we do at the library. So on the top left, we've got a white gloves event where people can come in and look at collections in depth. People really love putting on white gloves too, for some reason. It's sort of a bit prestigious. This gets people excited, which is quite fun. On the bottom right, we've got a conservation clinic where people bring in their own collections, and our conservators offer advice, so practical and affordable advice to those people for caring for their collections. So I've got these experiences under my belt working at the library, and I understand the significance of the collections, and I can see the ways in which the public want to access them. So from this point, I'm sort of trying to figure out how exactly is it that conservators facilitate access to collections by the public? What are different ways of doing it? And what kind of skills do we need to have to facilitate access? This idea sort of all started when I did my thesis project at the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre in Western Australia. And this project really involved going into their archives, pulling everything out of their room, the archive storage rooms, sorting it out and documenting it, and then finding the significant objects that, you know, they had some recordings or some documents or some photographs that they knew were in the collection somewhere, and they wanted us to find them and bring them out again and make them accessible. So on the right, here's a photo of what one of the storerooms looked like before we started, and there was 4 of these rooms. So this is one of my fellow students, Molly Culbertson. So Molly and I pulled out all of the audiovisual recordings and documented them and sorted them. And that way they were easily accessed in future by the community. And I guess it's important to mention too that some of those audiovisual and audio recordings went up to IATSIS, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra, and those materials were digitised so they could be shared with the community easier, which was a pretty good outcome. This is one of the storage rooms afterwards, and as you can see, it's a lot tidier and hopefully a lot easier for the community and the cultural centre staff to access the collections or the archives. And the big red arrow here just points to a really simple plastic box that has a bunch of photograph albums in it. And I thought this was really important to recognise of the seed of my interest in this whole idea about facilitating access, in that when we put this plastic storage box back on the shelves, we had some old people who came up to us and said, make sure you put it somewhere where we can reach it, where we know where it is, and where we can pull it off the shelf easily, open it up and sit down with the photo albums and have a chat to each other about, you know, whatever was special in those albums. So that's an example of how simple it can be to just facilitate access for a community, but in a large scale institution, it's a lot more complex than that. And that's what I'm interested in investigating more with my fellowship. So with my fellowship research, I really want to know in what ways do the community access collections in large scale cultural heritage institutions. I want to know what the role of the conservator is in that context, and I hope to see some examples of best practice. There are some key documents and texts that are influencing my research that I refer to quite often throughout the process. So one of those is the Australian Institute for Conservation of Cultural Materials Code of Ethics and Code of Practice. This is the professional guidelines for conservators in Australia. This is our professional body who represents us. The New Zealand Conservators, a Cultural Material Code of Ethics. The various collection policy documents of the host organisations, which is sort of the high level writing about access, but doesn't necessarily tell me exactly how conservators help to facilitate this, but it's a good starting point. The Canadian Conservation Institute guidelines for caring for sacred and culturally sensitive objects. I've found that had some really good examples in Canada of how they help their First Nations people care for collections, and they co-design modes of access and engagement with that community. Also, a really good book is called Preserving What's Valued. So some people in the audience might recognise this one from our university studies. Another one's On the Ethics of Cultural Heritage Conservation by Salvador Munoz-Vinas, and The Art of Relevance by Nina Simon. That book's about museum practice in general and how to make museums relevant to people. So my research objectives are looking at particularly research and documentation of collection items. So the use of terminology and language in our reports and documentation, and the use of shared expertise. So expertise doesn't only lie with the conservator, it lies with a lot of other sources. Conservation treatment. So what frameworks do we need to apply to our decision making? How do treatment decisions affect the object's story? And the co-authorship of treatment proposals with members of the community. And that's something that's happening a lot in Canada, which we've sort of started in Australia, but we're not quite there yet. Housing and storage. So how can we design housing and storage that welcomes or facilitates access by the community? And how do we work with culturally safe storage and housing of objects? Care and handling. So looking at culturally safe protocols and drawing on the expertise of the community as well as conservators. Something I'm really interested in is making the boundaries of our profession a bit more porous. So I'd like to know what is the conservator's role and responsibility when they work with the community? So how far does that extend and what are we actually responsible for? And just boiling it down to practical measures and hands-on skills, the application of our professional ethics and the application of cultural protocols. And I guess I should say also that there's a lot of work that's been done before me in this field. So what my ideas aren't new and they're not necessarily my own. So I am drawing on a lot of work that's been done in Australia and internationally. One of the things that I've done, obviously we can't travel at the moment, so I've just been attending a lot of online events. The fellowship has supported me to attend Museum Next Disrupt. And this was a big 3 to 4 day set of conferences and workshops and webinars and training programs for people in the museum sector. So some highlights from this, well, the biggest highlight for me actually was attending the talk by Elaine Human-Gurian. So she's a museum leader and a consultant and an author of a really key text called Civilizing the Museum. And she talked about intentional civility. So she spoke about the fact that museums have a social responsibility and they are the support for shared authority systems. There needs to be support for museum staff to facilitate new ways of engagement, and that collections are owned by the descendants of the makers, and that's something that's really quite important and perhaps we don't recognise all the time. And she also said that museums should welcome all because they house the collective memory of all. And that one really resonated with me because I work in a library, and my understanding of the function of a library in a community is that it's a place where everyone should be welcome and everyone has equal footing accessing information. You know, it's free, and the collections are part of accessing that information too. I also watched a talk by Scott Rudderman-Nolan at the Western Arts and Conservation College Student Conference. And he talked about Katia Katanga, which is an idea of holistic care for collections that draws on Maori specialist knowledge. So he's talking about some key points, which are heritage is about the people. And he asks, how is it that we've become so disconnected from objects? He asks, how are conservators seen by the community? So our language, our conduct, and our mindset counts as much as our expertise in materials or whatever field we have. And he looked at how we document and refer to collections. So talking about things like objectivity, which can be alienating use of language, scientific language can be alienating sometimes. And he looked at using the right cultural terms to strengthen the ties between treasures and people. I also attended the 14th International Conference on the Inclusive Museum. Two talks that I really enjoyed were Managing Museum Assets to Optimise Arts Engagement from Michael O'Hare, and Building Public Trust Through Collaboration. So these were both talks about using collections and engaging with people in a more direct manner. So for my fellowship research, I hope to go to New Zealand and visit their large cultural institutions to speak to their conservators and allied professionals about how they facilitate access to collections. So the prime example of this in my mind is the Te Awe project, which ran from 2013 to 2019. And that project involved the care of over 10,000 Maori taonga held in collections. So taonga is the word for treasures, so significant collections. So they basically reorganised and improved the care practices of those collections so they could be made more accessible to the visiting members of the community. And to do that, they drew on the expertise of a Maori weavers group, and they worked with the museum staff to enhance the knowledge about the collections, to help reorganise them, excuse me, and to co-design best practice protocols for the care of those collections. So that's an example of people coming into the museum and into the back of house and working directly with conservators. At the same institution, they also have the Pacific Collections Access Project, and that was happening from 2016 to 2019. So this one had three really clear objectives, and that was to improve knowledge and understanding of the museum's Pacific collection, to improve the safety of the Pacific collection, and to increase public access and engagement, especially for Pacific source communities with the museum and its Pacific collection. So this is another example of how the museum drew on the expertise of cultural knowledge holders in the community and invited them into the museum back of house to collaborate and improve on the collection care and increase engagement with that collection. So when I'm undertaking my research travel, I aim to speak to museum staff who are involved in these projects, and I particularly want to know about the experience of the storage technicians, the conservators, the curators, the collection managers and the engagement officers, and also the registrars. So I'd really like to hear directly from them about their reflections on these projects. Another institution that I plan to visit is the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington. Earlier this year, I reached out to Vicky-Anne Heikel, who's a paper conservator and a field conservator who works for the National Preservation Office and the Alexander Turnbull Library. And it's really been a huge privilege to connect with Vicky-Anne because she's given me a doorway into the large cultural heritage institutions in New Zealand. She's very experienced and she knows pretty much everyone, and she's worked with pretty much everyone that I hope to speak to. So that's been really useful. She's facilitated all the e-introductions with the conservators working all over New Zealand. And with those e-introductions, I've really been able to launch into the meaningful planning of my research. So Vicky-Anne runs preservation workshops with the Maori community, and she provides access on how to care for collections in a culturally safe way that also abides by best practice preservation standards. So I hope to attend some workshops with her and just observe how she applies her knowledge and practical skills and what kind of specialist knowledge and cultural protocols she draws on. Another institution, hopefully, I plan to do this all over about a month. In February next year, I hope to visit the Te Papa Museum in Wellington because they're an institution with bicultural leadership. And I really want to look at their exhibitions and borrowing of taonga from the community for exhibition. I want to learn more about their repatriation program, which is something similar to what Alex touched on before in terms of theft and stolen collections being given back to people or communities. I want to look at their collection storage areas and see how they store collection items in a culturally safe and accessible way. And I'll be speaking to their head conservator and manager of collection care practice, Anne Perentu, who manages the collection. So hopefully I'll get to hang out with her team for a day and have a look in their repository. That's pretty much it for now, because I haven't done the travel stage of my research, but hopefully that gave you some context into how my experiences are feeding into my idea and my objectives for the fellowship. And these are my thank yous. So I'll give you a second to read those. And that's it.